When you look at each of the empires that we have covered, we notice that each empire used a different way or a different methodology to keep their subjects in line. If we go back to the Assyrians, we remember that the Assyrians used the dispersion model. So what they did was they took the people from the place that they had conquered, dispersed them through the empire, and then brought members of the empire into that land. And that way, what it did was it diluted some of the realities that were there. And so you never had the insurrection. They were replaced by the Babylonians. And of course, the Babylonians used the concept of cutting off the head, because if you cut off the head, the body will die. And so they take the leadership of the people, all the thinkers, the leaders, the governors, and they move them and take them into exile in Babylon. And it's there in Babylon that they then can use those skills to the betterment of the empire, rather than using it to lead an insurrection of those people. The Persians send people back. They're much more enlightened. They give people freedom of religion, freedom of organization, but they always make sure that they believe or know that the Persians are the overlord of the process. They move to the Greeks, and the Greeks want to convert everybody and make them Greek. The process of Hellenization. That if I make you into a Greek, then you won't want to reject the Greek authority. The Romans, though, took one step beyond that. What they did was they furthered some of the connections of the Greeks. They still promoted the things that the Greeks did because they had absorbed a lot of the Greek culture into the Roman one as well. In many ways, there were lots of connections between them, both in for example, the belief in their gods, the belief in things like physical activity and so on. But where the Romans took one step beyond that was in the use of violence. The way in which the Romans sought to keep order within their kingdom or within their empire is by the use of violence. Either the actual use of violence or the threat of violence. And this is a very important concept to understand, because when the New Testament comes into the world, it comes into a world which uses violence as the means to control. Now, we need to hold on to that, because it's often the reason why the New Testament gets misinterpreted, because we go back into the environment, the context of the Roman Empire, and begin to actually interpret it from a position of violence, when in fact what Jesus was doing, and in fact what the New Testament does, is it speaks into a position of violence with a word of non-violence. Jesus says, love your enemies, do good to those who hurt you. If someone should hit you on one cheek, turn to him also the other cheek. Now, when you see those words, often we find it very hard to interpret them, because we interpret them from a position of violence and the use of punishment and violence as a means to create order and out of chaos. That was very much a Roman perspective. And yet the New Testament, and I believe the gospel itself, wants to speak against that very concept. How we deal with that, we will talk about as we continue this particular course. But violence was there. The other part of violence, or at least the outworking of violence, was the concept of slavery. In fact, 2/3 of the Roman Empire were slaves. And as slaves, they really were just pieces of furniture. They weren't seen to be human beings who had aspirations and hopes and desires, but rather they were seen only to be used. It was about how useful they were. And so in some ways, what we do when we look at the Bible, we may look vainly for a word against slavery. There is none. In fact, it would seem that it would, if not condone slavery, at least say that slavery was part and parcel of living within the Roman environment. Now, why is that? Why wouldn't it say that slavery is wrong? Because the Bible really isn't trying to interfere with the kingdom here, per se. What it's actually saying is that the kingdom of God is the one that has to supersede us. But what it is saying is that if you're a master of a slave, the question then is that which kingdom are you going to live out in the connection with slaves? We see that, for example, in the book or the letter of Paul to Philemon. That particular book is one which really is telling in the way in which Paul would want to bring about social change. Not by bringing revolution and overthrowing government, but rather by changing the social life and the heart of people, particularly those people who are connected into that unjust system. For when we change them, we change the system that they're part of. These are concepts that are there. But slavery is an outworking of the violence of the Roman Empire. It's that violence that seeks to keep control, that seeks to enforce the control and the will of Rome on the people. It's the concept of enforcing control and will that seeps into the church as the church becomes a Roman church in the 4th century. Something that we've really not shrugged off and still is part of our church today. That concept of enforcing will through the use of punishment. In many ways, very the antithesis of what Jesus was talking about in the good news.